6 weeks after losing everything, Calvin Brooks spent his last dollar buying a forgotten bakery across from his son's new school, believing it was their only chance to start over. But before he baked his very first loaf, the ruthless CEO who had fired him showed up with a shocking offer to buy the building on the spot. What she didn't realize was that Calvin's refusal would uncover a long-buried secret hidden inside the bakery's walls, one powerful enough to expose years of deception, protect countless children, and prove that a father's integrity is worth far more than any paycheck or fortune. The old bell above the bakery door no longer rang. It only gave a dull metal rattle whenever the wind pushed against the warped wooden frame, as if Morning Bell Bakery had grown too tired to welcome anyone inside. Calvin Brooks stood on a paint-splattered ladder, pulling loose the last rusted screws from a faded sign that had watched over Millstone, Pennsylvania for decades. Dust floated through the cool morning air, glowing beneath the pale October sun. Across the narrow street, children hurried through the front gates of Lincoln Elementary, while parents balanced coffee cups and backpacks before rushing toward another workday. Calvin paused for just a second. He smiled when he spotted a familiar 10-year-old boy waving from the sidewalk. Eli. The oversized backpack nearly swallowed him, but he still found time to lift the old wooden ruler he carried everywhere, pointing it toward the bakery with a grin that said everything his words never needed to. Calvin raised a grease-stained hand and waved back. "I'll have the front windows cleaned before you're out," he called. "And I'll measure where the menu goes," Eli shouted. Then the crossing guard urged the children forward, and the moment disappeared into the rhythm of school bells and passing trucks. Calvin climbed down from the ladder slowly. 6 weeks earlier, he had walked out of Caldwell Nutrition carrying nothing but a cardboard box and the quiet determination not to let his son watch him break. Now, every dollar he had left rested inside these cracked brick walls. Morning Bell wasn't beautiful. Half the front windows were clouded by years of flour dust. The brick chimney leaned ever so slightly toward the alley. Inside, the old ovens smelled of cold iron instead of fresh bread. But the apartment upstairs was small enough that he could hear the school dismissal bell from the kitchen. That mattered. He unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The silence greeted him first. Then came the smell of old wood, stale flour trapped inside forgotten corners, and rain that had seeped into the walls over too many winters. He rolled up his sleeves and carried another stack of broken shelving toward the back kitchen. Every movement echoed through the empty building. Hammer, footsteps, wood scraping across concrete. It wasn't much, but for the first time in weeks, every sound belonged to something he was building instead of something he had lost. As he pulled away another sheet of damaged drywall behind the ancient brick oven, something metallic caught the sunlight. A thick steel pipe. Old. Covered in decades of dust. Stamped into its surface was an emblem almost hidden beneath rust. Calvin frowned. The symbol looked strangely familiar. Before he could brush away the rest of the dirt, tires rolled slowly across the gravel outside. Not a delivery truck. Not a neighbor. A black luxury sedan stopped directly in front of Morning Bell. Its polished paint reflected the broken bakery windows like a mirror from another world. The driver's door opened first, then another. A man in an expensive navy suit stepped out holding a leather portfolio. Calvin recognized the look immediately. Corporate. Real estate. Someone who measured buildings by square footage instead of memories. Then the rear passenger door opened. Vanessa Caldwell stepped onto the sidewalk. Her cream-colored coat looked untouched by the dust blowing across Main Street. She stood perfectly still for a moment, studying the weathered bakery before her sharp eyes settled on Calvin. Neither of them spoke. The last time they had stood this close together had been inside a glass boardroom 6 weeks ago. He had worn a pressed dress shirt. She had been seated at the head of a polished conference table. Now he stood covered in drywall dust with a pry bar still in his hand. She broke the silence first. "So, this is where you disappeared." Her voice remained calm, professional, exactly the way he remembered. Calvin rested the pry bar against the wall. "I wasn't aware anyone was looking." The suited man stepped forward. "Mr. Brooks, I'm Daniel Pierce, Director of Property Acquisitions for Caldwell Development." Calvin nodded once. Vanessa's attention drifted beyond him. Not toward the old display cases. Not toward the faded bakery sign. Toward the exposed section of wall behind the oven. Her eyes lingered there, just long enough for Calvin to notice. Then she looked back at him. "We've been purchasing several properties in Millstone." "I heard." "This building sits inside one of those redevelopment zones." Calvin folded his arms. "And?" Daniel opened the leather folder. "We'd like to make you an offer." He slid a printed document across the scarred wooden counter. The number printed near the bottom made Calvin blink despite himself. It was enough to erase every debt he had. Enough to rent a better apartment. Enough to keep Eli in this school without worrying about another mortgage payment. Vanessa watched his expression carefully. "It's more than you paid." "I know. You could walk away to debt without risking everything." Calvin looked down at the contract. Then through the dusty front window toward the school across the street. Children laughed somewhere beyond the fence. He imagined Eli finishing classes this afternoon, running across the road, measuring cabinets with that old wooden ruler like none of the world's problems existed. Finally, he pushed the contract back. "I'm not selling." Daniel looked surprised. Vanessa didn't. She simply studied him for another long second. "You've invested everything you have into a building that's been empty for years." "I have. And if this fails," she glanced around the cracked walls and aging ovens, "your son loses everything with you." Calvin met her eyes without raising his voice. "My son deserves to watch his father build something honest." A breeze slipped through the broken window behind the old oven. Somewhere inside the exposed wall, the metal pipe gave a faint, hollow sound. Vanessa turned her head almost instinctively toward it, just for a heartbeat. Then she looked back at Calvin. There was something in her expression now that hadn't been there when she first arrived. Not disappointment, not frustration, recognition of something. Without another word, she closed the folder. "We'll be in touch." She walked back toward the sedan. Before climbing inside, she looked once more at the bakery. Not at Calvin. At the exposed wall behind him. The sedan disappeared down Main Street. Calvin remained standing in the doorway, watching until the taillights vanished beyond the old steel mill. Only then did he turn back toward the crumbling kitchen. His eyes settled once more on the rusted pipe hidden inside the wall. Why would the CEO of one of the largest food companies in the state care so much about a forgotten bakery that everyone else had abandoned years ago? The question stayed with Calvin long after the sound of the black sedan disappeared beyond Main Street. He reached toward the pipe again, brushing away another layer of rust with the sleeve of his work shirt. The faded emblem became a little clearer, but not enough to explain anything. It looked like an old company mark, worn smooth by decades of heat and flour dust. He let it go. There were more urgent things to worry about than mysteries hidden inside brick walls. The electricity still flickered every time he switched on 2 lights at once. Half the plumbing refused to cooperate. The front display case leaned slightly to one side, and the roof over the storage room would never survive another Pennsylvania winter without repairs. By the time the afternoon school bell rang across the street, Calvin had filled 3 contractor bags with broken plaster. A familiar voice echoed through the empty bakery. "Dad!" Eli pushed open the front door with both hands, his oversized backpack sliding off one shoulder before he even reached the counter. "I measured it." Calvin laughed. "You measured what?" "The front window." Eli carefully pulled an old wooden ruler from his backpack, as though it were something fragile enough to break if handled too quickly. "I think the menu board should hang right here." He pressed the ruler against the dusty wall beside the entrance, squinting one eye as he checked the distance twice. "Customers should see it before they smell the bread." Calvin smiled. "I thought smelling the bread was the whole point." "It is." Eli grinned. "But Grandma always said people eat with their eyes first." "Your mum," Calvin corrected softly. Eli nodded. "Yeah." For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The ruler had once belonged to Rachel. Its edges were rounded from years of use, faint pencil marks still scattered across the wood where she had measured pie crusts, cinnamon rolls, birthday cakes, and once, when Eli was only 4, the height of a tiny kitchen stool because he insisted on helping her knead dough. She never bought expensive baking tools. She always reached for that ruler. She used to lay it across a sheet of dough and say, "If everyone gets the same size piece, nobody feels forgotten." Calvin could still hear her voice as clearly as the smell of fresh bread that used to fill their first little apartment. Eli traced one of the faded pencil marks with his thumb. "I think Mom would have liked this place." "I hope so." "She would have painted the walls yellow." Calvin looked around the dim bakery. "Probably." "And she'd say those shelves need plants." "Definitely." The two of them laughed quietly. The sound filled the empty building better than any music could. Later that evening, they carried folding chairs upstairs into the tiny apartment above the bakery. It wasn't much. 1 bedroom, a pull-out couch, a kitchenette barely large enough for 2 people to stand side by side. But through the front window, they could see the lights from Lincoln Elementary across the street. Eli unpacked his books while Calvin quietly opened an envelope that had arrived in the morning mail. Electric bill, insurance payment, property taxes. He added the numbers together twice, then a third time. The total left almost nothing. He folded the papers before Eli could notice. "You hungry?" Calvin asked. "I could eat." "Diner tonight?" Eli shook his head. "We should save money." The words hit Calvin harder than he expected. A 10-year-old shouldn't think that way. "I promised we'd celebrate buying the bakery." "We already did." "When?" Eli smiled. "When you gave me my own key." He reached into his pocket and held it up proudly. Calvin looked away for a second, pretending to search through the grocery bag so his son wouldn't notice the emotion rising in his eyes. That tiny brass key had meant more to Eli than any expensive toy ever could. After dinner, they returned downstairs. Moonlight stretched through the dusty front windows. Eli wandered toward the counter and carefully laid Rachel's ruler across the old wood. "Dad?" "Yeah." "If Mum were here..." Calvin looked up. "Do you think she'd tell us to sell the bakery to that lady?" The room became very still. Outside, a freight train rumbled somewhere beyond the old steel mills. Calvin stared at the ruler resting across the scarred countertop. He wanted to answer immediately. He wanted to tell his son everything would be fine. Instead, he quietly placed his hand over the ruler. "I don't know." It was the most honest answer he had. Eli nodded without another question. Somehow that silence hurt more than any words could. As Calvin switched off the lights for the night, he couldn't stop thinking about Vanessa Caldwell's offer. Enough money to erase every worry. Enough money to protect Eli. Or enough money to teach his son that fear should always be allowed to make the final decision. Calvin barely slept. Before sunrise, he stood alone in the bakery kitchen, staring at the cracked countertop while the old coffee maker struggled through another pot. The smell wasn't nearly as rich as Rachel's coffee used to be, but it warmed the cold apartment above the shop all the same. His phone buzzed. An email reminder. One final notice from Caldwell Nutrition, informing him that his employee portal would be permanently deleted at midnight. He almost ignored it. Instead, he opened the archived documents one last time. The screen reflected in his tired eyes. And suddenly, he was no longer standing inside Morning Bell. He was back inside the glass conference room on the 26th floor. 6 weeks earlier. The polished walnut table stretched nearly the length of the room. Morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Pittsburgh, but no one seemed interested in the view. Every chair around the table was occupied. Department heads, corporate attorneys, financial officers. At the far end sat Vanessa Caldwell. Calvin had attended dozens of executive meetings over the years, yet something felt different that morning. No one smiled. No one made small talk. Miles Denton stood beside the presentation screen with a remote in one hand. "Our district expansion depends on winning this contract," he said. "If we delay production now, 300 factory jobs are at risk." The slide behind him showed profit forecasts, growth projections, shareholder expectations. Then another slide appeared. Ingredient substitutions, cheaper stabilizers, lower production costs, higher margins. Most people in the room nodded without hesitation. Calvin didn't. He slowly opened the binder he had brought with him. "I can't approve this." Silence settled across the room. Miles looked almost amused. "Excuse me?" Calvin turned several pages until he found the report he had highlighted the night before. "This stabilizer has known interaction risks for children with certain metabolic disorders." "It's an extremely rare condition," Miles replied. "It's still a child. The formula meets every federal requirement. It meets the minimum." Miles folded his arms. "We're talking about a handful of students." Calvin looked around the room. No one else spoke. No one challenged the numbers glowing on the screen. Finally, Vanessa leaned forward. "Can the risk be managed?" "Yes," Calvin answered. "How?" "We notify every participating school, clearly identify the formula change, and give districts the option to request the original recipe for students with medical needs." Miles immediately shook his head. "That delays rollout by weeks." "It delays it because children's health deserves to come before deadlines." Another uncomfortable silence. Vanessa lowered her eyes to the executive summary lying in front of her. "Miles tells me you've raised similar objections several times." "I've raised documented safety concerns. The board expects this contract to move forward." Calvin nodded slowly. I understand. Vanessa looked directly at him. So I'll ask you one final time. Will you sign the approval? Calvin glanced toward the signature page waiting beside him. One signature. A single stroke of ink. It would protect his career, his paycheck, his health insurance, everything Eli depended on. His hand rested on the pen. Then he quietly pushed it away. No. Miles let out an impatient breath. You're putting hundreds of livelihoods at risk over a hypothetical scenario. Calvin's voice remained calm. I'm refusing to gamble with children who don't get a vote. Vanessa closed the folder in front of her. The sound echoed louder than anyone expected. Then I'm left with no choice. She spoke without anger, without cruelty, almost mechanically. Effective immediately, your employment with Caldwell Nutrition is terminated for insubordination and refusal to carry out executive directives. Nobody around the table protested. Nobody looked Calvin in the eye. He stood slowly, gathered his binder, and slipped Rachel's old family photograph, kept inside its cover for years, back into his briefcase. When he reached the door, he stopped. Without turning around, he spoke quietly. One day, only then did he look back at Vanessa. You're going to read the pages that never made it into that folder. Neither of them realized that those words would follow them far longer than either career. The memory faded as the laptop screen dimmed. Calvin closed it gently. Upstairs, he heard Eli moving around before school. He slipped the computer back into its bag and looked through the bakery window toward the quiet street. He had lost his job because he believed one signature could change a child's life. Now another decision waited for him. Whether to keep believing that doing the right thing was still worth the price. Calvin tucked the laptop into a cardboard box and carried it upstairs before Eli came down for breakfast. There were some memories a father could share, and others that could wait until his son was old enough to understand why good people sometimes paid the highest cost for doing the right thing. The little apartment smelled of toasted bread and scrambled eggs. Eli was already dressed for school, sitting at the tiny kitchen table with Rachel's old wooden ruler lying beside his cereal bowl. He wasn't measuring anything this time. He simply rolled it back and forth between his palms while watching his father move quietly around the room. You didn't sleep much, Eli said. I had a few things on my mind. Was it the bakery? Calvin forced a smile. It's always the bakery. Eli nodded, though neither of them believed the answer. The walk across the street to Lincoln Elementary took less than 3 minutes. They waited together at the crosswalk while delivery trucks rumbled toward the old steel district, their engines echoing through the chilly morning air. Just before the crossing guard waved the children forward, Eli reached into his backpack and pulled out the brass key to Morning Bell. You sure I can keep this? It's your bakery too. The boy slipped the key back into his pocket with the kind of careful pride only children could have. I'll come help after school. I'll be here. Calvin watched until Eli disappeared inside the building. Only then did he cross the street toward the bakery. He had barely unlocked the front door when another vehicle stopped outside. Not the black sedan, a silver SUV. Daniel Pierce stepped out alone, carrying the same leather portfolio as before. I won't take much of your time. Calvin sighed softly. I thought your answer was already in that folder. It was. Daniel looked around the quiet street before lowering his voice. Our offer has increased. He opened the folder. The new number was nearly double the first one. Calvin stared at it for several long seconds. The amount would erase every bill sitting unopened in the apartment upstairs. It would replace Eli's worn sneakers. It would pay for college savings Calvin hadn't been able to touch since Rachel got sick. "You've done your homework," Calvin said quietly. "We understand your financial situation. I didn't realize it was public information." "It isn't." Daniel hesitated. "Ms. Caldwell believes this is simply the most practical solution." Calvin looked through the dusty front window toward the elementary school again. The practical solution for who? For everyone. Daniel spoke without arrogance. "You've invested everything into a building that may never pass inspection. Even if it does, opening a bakery from scratch isn't easy. I know. You could start over somewhere else." Calvin smiled sadly. "That's exactly what I'm trying to do." Daniel closed the folder halfway. "Mr. Brooks, off the record, I don't think Ms. Caldwell wants to see you fail." "No? No. Then why does she keep trying to buy the one thing that's keeping me from failing?" Daniel had no answer. Instead, he slid the contract across the old counter one last time. "Take a day." "I don't need a day." "You haven't even read it." "I don't have to." Calvin gently pushed the papers back. "The first time your company asked me to sign something I didn't believe in, it cost me my job." He met Daniel's eyes. "I'm not signing something I don't believe in now." Daniel slowly gathered the papers. As he reached the door, he paused. "There is one thing you should know." Calvin waited. "This property wasn't chosen by accident." Before Calvin could ask another question, Daniel seemed to catch himself. He simply nodded. "Have a good day, Mr. Brooks." The SUV pulled away. Calvin stood motionless inside the bakery, replaying those words. Not chosen by accident. He walked back toward the old brick oven, almost without thinking. The rusted pipe still stretched through the exposed wall, silent beneath decades of dust. This time, he noticed something he had missed before. Just below the faded company emblem, nearly hidden beneath corrosion, were several stamped numbers, not random markings. Identification numbers, manufacturing numbers. Someone had wanted that pipe catalogued. Someone had expected it to matter. Behind him, the school bell rang across the street, signaling the start of another ordinary day. But nothing about morning bell felt ordinary anymore. For the first time, Calvin wasn't simply wondering whether Vanessa wanted the building. He was beginning to wonder what she was afraid someone might find inside it. The question stayed in the back of his mind, but they didn't replace the work waiting in front of him. Morning bell wasn't going to repair itself. Calvin picked up his hammer, secured another loose board beneath the front counter, then crawled beneath the old oven to inspect a cracked ventilation duct. Dust coated his arms. Rust stained his fingertips. Every repair seemed to uncover two more problems hiding underneath. By late afternoon, the bakery looked only slightly better than it had that morning. Still, it was progress. Across the street, the final school bell echoed through Millstone. A few minutes later, the front door opened. Eli stepped inside with his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. "I finished my math test." "How'd it go?" "I think I missed one." Calvin smiled. "I'll survive." "So will I." The boy laughed and immediately pulled Rachel's wooden ruler from his backpack. "I measured the front window again." "You already measured it yesterday." "I wanted to make sure." He carefully stretched the ruler across the empty display case. "If people can see the pastries from outside, They'll come in. Calvin looked around the silent bakery. I hope you're right. Before Eli could answer, another knock came at the front door. A woman stood outside holding the hand of a little girl wearing a pink jacket and birthday ribbons in her hair. She looked exhausted. Dark circles framed her eyes. A hospital identification badge still hung from her jacket pocket. Are you open? She asked hesitantly. Calvin shook his head. Not yet. I'm sorry. The little girl's face fell immediately. The woman forced a smile. I know. Someone told me the old bakery might have cakes again. Calvin glanced toward the nearly empty shelves. I wish they did. She looked embarrassed. I ordered a birthday cake from the grocery store this morning, but my debit card was declined. My paycheck doesn't clear until tomorrow. She squeezed her daughter's hand gently. I promised her she'd still have candles tonight. The little girl quickly looked down at the floor. I'm okay, Mum. Calvin wasn't listening anymore. His eyes had drifted toward a small practice cake sitting inside a cardboard box on the prep table. It wasn't perfect. The frosting leaned slightly to one side because he was still relearning skills Rachel had once made look effortless. He had baked it the night before simply to test the old oven. It was the only finished cake in the building. He carried the box to the counter. This one's yours. The woman blinked. I can't pay you. I know. I really will tomorrow. You don't owe me tomorrow either. She stared at him. I can't just take it. Calvin smiled. Birthdays don't wait for direct deposits. The little girl's eyes widened. Really? He knelt beside her. Really? She hugged the cake box as though someone had handed her treasure. I'm Lily. I'm Calvin. And that's my son, Eli. Eli stepped forward. Happy birthday. Lily beamed. Thank you. Her mother finally found her voice. My name's Marisol Vega. She reached into her purse anyway. I at least want to leave something. Calvin gently closed her hand around the few crumpled bills she had managed to find. Buy candles. For a moment, nobody spoke. The silence inside Morning Bell felt different now. Warmer. Marisol looked around the unfinished bakery. You've got a lot of work ahead of you. That's one way to put it. She noticed the old commercial oven standing half disassembled. You know? She hesitated. I used to maintain industrial kitchen equipment before I started working nights at Green Valley Care Center. Calvin looked up. You did? For almost 11 years. She walked toward the oven without waiting for permission. This vent isn't just dirty. She pointed toward the metal housing above the baking chamber. It's dangerous. Calvin stepped beside her. What do you mean? If you fire this oven the way it is now, exhaust won't clear properly. She removed a flashlight from her work bag. I've seen this set up before. She crouched beside the exposed wall and shined the light through the opening behind the oven. Instead of looking at the damaged vent, her beam stopped on the rusted metal pipe hidden inside the brickwork. Her expression changed instantly. She reached out and brushed away another layer of dust. That's not a gas line. Calvin frowned. No? Marisol slowly shook her head. No. She followed the pipe deeper into the wall with the flashlight. This was part of something much bigger. She looked back at Calvin, confusion replacing certainty. I've never seen one inside a neighborhood bakery before. Then she whispered the words that made the room suddenly feel much quieter. This belonged to an old production system. Calvin walked over beside her, wiping the dust from his hands onto an old shop towel. A production system in a neighborhood bakery? Marisol nodded slowly, keeping the flashlight trained on the pipe. Not the kind that mixes dough for one shop. This pipe was built to move ingredients between buildings. I've worked on commercial kitchens for years. But this, she paused. This came from something much larger. She reached farther into the opening until her fingers brushed against a rusted metal bracket. It hasn't been touched in decades. Eli leaned closer, curiosity replacing the excitement he'd carried home from school. So this bakery used to be famous? Marisol smiled. I don't know about famous, but it definitely mattered to someone. Calvin looked at the faded Caldwell emblem stamped into the steel. The image of Vanessa standing silently in front of this very wall returned to him. She hadn't looked at the bakery. She had looked at this. The thought stayed with him as the sun disappeared behind the old steel mill, painting the windows orange before fading into grey. The next morning, reality returned faster than mystery. Calvin drove 40 minutes to the largest flour distributor in Beaver County. Towering silos overlooked the highway, and forklifts carried pallet after pallet across the loading yard. Business was booming. Inside the office, a clerk glanced at his application before disappearing into the warehouse. A few minutes later, the owner, Rick Halpin, walked out with an apologetic smile. I appreciate you stopping by in person. I figured introductions still mattered. They do. Rick sighed. But I'm afraid we can't open a new commercial account. Calvin frowned. I thought you supplied independent bakeries. We usually do. So what's changed? Rick hesitated long enough to answer without really answering. We've entered an exclusive regional agreement. With Caldwell Nutrition? Rick's silence confirmed it. Calvin glanced through the warehouse windows. Hundreds of flour sacks sat stacked almost to the ceiling. You don't look short on inventory. We're committed. Calvin understood. Nobody wanted trouble with the largest food company in western Pennsylvania. He thanked the owner anyway. You've been honest with me. Rick lowered his eyes. I wish honesty changed the answer. By noon, Calvin found himself sitting across from a loan officer at Millstone Community Bank. Sandra Ellis reviewed his paperwork carefully. You've invested almost everything into the property. Yes. And your projected revenue depends on opening before the holidays. That's correct. She tapped her pen against the application. That's a narrow margin. I know. What collateral can you offer besides the bakery? Calvin smiled faintly. If I had anything else, I wouldn't be asking for a loan. Sandra looked genuinely sympathetic. I can approve a much smaller line of credit. It won't cover the equipment. I'm sorry. As Calvin signed the reduced paperwork, another customer laughed with a banker 2 desks away while discussing plans for a new sporting goods store. Within minutes, the man stood, shook hands, and walked away smiling with a folder noticeably thicker than Calvin's. He didn't know their circumstances. He refused to assume. Still, the contrast settled quietly inside him. By the time he picked Eli up from school, the weight of the day showed on his face. They crossed Main Street together without speaking much. Halfway across, Eli finally asked, Did the flower place say yes? Calvin kept his eyes on the crosswalk. Not this time. And the bank? We'll figure it out. That answer was enough. Eli knew what "we'll figure it out" really meant. Back inside the bakery, the boy quietly pulled Rachel's wooden ruler from his backpack. Instead of measuring shelves, he slipped it into the bottom pocket and zipped the bag closed. Calvin noticed. "You don't want to use it today?" Eli shrugged. "I don't know." A long silence followed. Finally, he spoke again, barely above a whisper. "Someone at school said you got fired because you made your company lose a lot of money." Calvin's hands stopped moving. "They said people don't fire good workers." The words landed harder than any bank rejection or business refusal. Calvin knelt until they were eye level. "Did you believe them?" Eli looked away toward the empty display cases. "I didn't want to." Calvin rested a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "Sometimes doing the right thing costs more than doing the easy thing. Then why do it?" Calvin looked around the unfinished bakery, the cracked windows, the patched ceiling, the worn brick walls that seemed to fight every repair. "Because someday," he said quietly, "I want you to know that your father could lose a job without losing who he was." That night, after Eli had fallen asleep upstairs, Calvin sat alone beneath the yellow worklight with a stack of unpaid bills spread across the counter. He calculated the numbers over and over. Even with the smaller loan, they would run out of money long before morning bell was ready to open. Just as he reached for another invoice, headlights swept across the front windows. A county building inspector stepped out of a white pickup carrying a clipboard and a bright orange notice. Without even stepping inside, he walked straight toward the wall behind the old oven. Someone, somewhere, had filed an anonymous complaint about structural concerns inside Morning Bell Bakery. The county inspector introduced himself as Thomas Harlan, a grey-haired man whose work boots looked far older than his clipboard. "I'm not here to shut you down," he said calmly. "I'm here because once a complaint is filed, I have to verify it." Calvin stepped aside. "Take all the time you need." Thomas walked directly toward the exposed brick wall. His flashlight swept across the old pipe, then paused on the faded emblem stamped into the metal. His eyebrows rose ever so slightly. "That's unusual. You've seen it before?" "Not here." He knelt, ran a finger across the rusted numbers, then copied them into a small notebook. "I can't approve any work around this section until someone identifies exactly what it is." "So the renovation stops?" "Only around this wall." But if this supports the oven," Thomas nodded, "then the bakery can't receive its final occupancy permit." The words landed quietly, but their meaning was unmistakable. Morning Bell couldn't open, not until the mystery inside the wall was solved. After the inspector left, Calvin locked the front door and leaned against the old counter. Every delay meant another electric bill, another mortgage payment, another week of watching Eli pretend not to worry. Marisol arrived just before sunset after finishing another overnight shift. She listened without interrupting as Calvin explained what the inspector had found. "We need records," she finally said. "Records? Old building permits, factory blueprints, property archives. You think they'll still exist? If this system was important enough to stamp serial numbers on every pipe." She looked back toward the exposed wall. "Someone documented it." The next morning, the three of them drove to Millstone's Municipal Archive, a red brick building tucked behind the public library where old maps, newspapers, and property records had been stored for generations. The archive smelled of aging paper and polished wood. Rows of grey filing cabinets stretched across the room. An elderly archivist named Helen Foster, adjusted her glasses as Calvin explained what they were searching for. Morning Bell Bakery. She smiled thoughtfully. I haven't heard that name in years. Helen disappeared into a back room and returned pushing a metal cart stacked with oversized ledgers, rolled blueprints, and dusty file boxes. You'll probably find something in these. Hours slipped by. Blueprint after blueprint showed plumbing lines, electrical wiring, drainage systems. Nothing explained the strange pipe. Eli sat quietly beside them with Rachel's wooden ruler resting across an old map, using it to flatten curled corners while Calvin searched through yellowed engineering drawings. Then Marisol suddenly stopped turning pages. Calvin. He looked up. She had unfolded a blueprint nearly 4 feet wide. The outline of Morning Bell filled the center. But it wasn't alone. A series of underground conduits extended beneath the street toward another property several blocks away. Calvin leaned closer. That can't be right. Helen adjusted her glasses again. Oh. Her voice softened. I remember hearing about this. What is it? Calvin asked. Before Caldwell Nutrition existed. She tapped the faded title block. Arthur Caldwell owned a family bakery supply company. Calvin felt his pulse quicken. Helen pointed to the blueprint. Morning Bell wasn't simply a neighborhood bakery. It served as the company's original test kitchen. The room fell silent. Marisol traced one of the underground lines with her finger. It connected directly to the first processing facility. Helen nodded. They experimented with recipes here before expanding production. Calvin stared at the blueprint. The mysterious pipe, Vanessa's offer, the inspection, the anonymous complaint. None of it seemed random anymore. As Helen carefully lifted another folder from the cart, an old handwritten document slipped onto the table. Its pages were brittle with age. Across the bottom was a familiar signature. Arthur Caldwell. Calvin unfolded the letter slowly. Most of the ink had faded, but one sentence remained perfectly readable. Never remove the separation system under any circumstance if children's specialty formulas are being produced. No explanation. No technical note. Just a warning. Marisol exchanged a long glance with Calvin. Neither of them spoke. Eli quietly looked from the letter to the blueprint. Then he pointed toward a tiny engineering symbol printed beside the mysterious pipeline. I've seen that before. Calvin looked at him. Where? Eli reached into his backpack and pulled out Rachel's wooden ruler. Earlier that morning, while Marisol had been examining the exposed wall, he had absent-mindedly copied several strange symbols into the margin of his math notebook. He opened it now. The same symbol was there. The metal piece but behind the bakery wall, he said softly, has this exact mark on it. Marisol's expression changed instantly. She looked back at the blueprint, then at Calvin. If that's true, she took a slow breath. The most important part of that old system may still be hidden inside Morning Bell. Calvin drove back to the bakery with the blueprint carefully rolled beneath his arm. But his thoughts were no longer centered on the old pipe. They were centered on Arthur Caldwell. The warning in the handwritten note had been too specific to ignore. Never remove the separation system. Not if children's specialty formulas were being produced. Those words echoed in his mind all evening as he secured the blueprint inside a filing cabinet upstairs. Eli fell asleep with Rachel's wooden ruler resting beside his notebook, unaware that the symbol he had copied might become the key to everything. Across the state, the lights on the top floor of Caldwell Nutrition still burned long after sunset. Vanessa Caldwell stood alone in her office, staring at the photograph Daniel Pierce had emailed that afternoon. It showed the exposed wall inside Morning Bell. More importantly, it showed the rusted company emblem. She enlarged the image, then enlarged it again. The logo wasn't from Caldwell Nutrition. It belonged to Caldwell Family Foods, the company her father had built before expanding into industrial food production decades earlier. She picked up the phone. "Claire?" Her executive assistant answered immediately. "Yes, Ms. Caldwell. I need the complete personnel file for Calvin Brooks." There was a brief pause. "The file from Human Resources?" "No." Vanessa walked toward the window overlooking Pittsburgh. "I want every technical report, every safety recommendation, every internal email connected to his dismissal. Tonight?" "Tonight." An hour later, 3 archive boxes sat on the conference table. Vanessa loosened her jacket and began reading. At first, everything appeared exactly as she remembered. Executive summaries, production schedules, meeting minutes. Then she opened the engineering reports. Something felt wrong. The document Miles Denton had presented to the board was only 12 pages long. Yet the archive index listed 19. She counted again. 12. She searched the electronic record. Several attachments were missing. She frowned. "Claire." Her assistant stepped inside. "Can you pull the server history on this file?" "You think something was deleted?" "I don't know. But I intend to find out." While the IT department searched archived backups, Vanessa opened Calvin's original safety assessment. The first pages described ingredient substitutions she already knew about. Then she reached a sentence highlighted in yellow. "Potential cross-contact risk cannot be evaluated without reviewing the existing separation system." She stopped reading. The words sounded strangely familiar. Separation system. Her eyes drifted toward the photograph from Morning Bell lying beside the report. The old pipe. Arthur Caldwell's logo. She suddenly remembered Daniel mentioning that Calvin had refused to sell after discovering something inside the wall. For the first time since visiting the bakery, Vanessa wondered whether Calvin hadn't simply bought an abandoned building. Perhaps he had unknowingly purchased a forgotten piece of her father's original work. A notification appeared on her computer. Archived files recovered. Claire opened the folder. There were deleted attachments. Who removed them? We're still checking. Vanessa opened the restored document. Her breathing slowed. Page after page contained technical observations she had never seen before. Detailed calculations, maintenance concerns, repeated warnings from Calvin recommending additional testing before production increased. Every report carried the same submission date, weeks before the board meeting, weeks before she signed his termination papers. None of those pages had been included in the executive packet Miles Denton placed in front of her. She leaned back in her chair. For the first time since becoming CEO, certainty gave way to doubt. Had Calvin really exaggerated the danger? Or had she dismissed the one employee who had tried to prevent it? Her office phone rang. Miles Denton. She let it ring twice before answering. I heard you've been reviewing old files, he said casually. I've been catching up. There isn't much to find. So you've already reviewed them recently? A brief silence followed. I just don't want you wasting time reopening settled issues. Vanessa looked once more at Calvin's missing reports. I'll decide what's settled. She ended the call before he could respond. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the glass. Inside Morning Bell, Calvin locked the front door after another long day of repairs, unaware that the woman who had once signed his dismissal had just discovered the first crack in the story she'd been told. Before Vanessa could decide what to do next, her assistant rushed back into the office without knocking. Her face had turned pale. "Ms. Caldwell, what is it?" "A children's hospital just reported a serious medical reaction." Vanessa stood immediately. "It involved one of our new breakfast products." The room fell silent. Claire handed her a tablet displaying the first incident report from Children's Mercy Hospital. A 10-year-old student had experienced a severe medical reaction shortly after eating one of Caldwell Nutrition's new breakfast pastries served through a school meal program. The child was stable. The doctors expected a full recovery, but the words that caught Vanessa's attention weren't the physician's notes. They were the ingredients. She read the list twice. Then she looked back at Calvin's restored report lying open across the conference table. The same stabilizer. The same warning. Her pulse quickened. Who else received that shipment? Claire opened another file. So far, 83 school districts. Vanessa didn't hesitate. Stop every truck that's still on the road. Claire froze. That would delay tomorrow morning's deliveries. I know. It could cost millions. Vanessa closed the tablet. It could cost something far more important. Across the hallway, Miles Denton was already waiting outside the executive conference room. "I heard about the hospital," he said as soon as she approached. "The reaction doesn't prove anything." "No," Vanessa answered quietly. "But it proves we don't know enough." Miles followed her inside. "The legal department recommends waiting for laboratory confirmation before making any public statement. And while we wait, we avoid unnecessary panic." Vanessa stared at him. "You're asking me to keep shipping the product. I'm asking you not to destroy a statewide contract because of one isolated event." Before she could answer, another executive entered, carrying updated transportation reports. "Half the Monday shipments have already left." Vanessa looked at the map. Blue dots spread across western Pennsylvania. School after school. District after district. She thought about the sentence Calvin had spoken inside the boardroom weeks earlier. "I'm refusing to gamble with children who don't get a vote." At the time, she had believed he was exaggerating. Now she wasn't certain of anything. Meanwhile, across the state, Calvin was replacing warped floorboards inside Morning Bell when his phone rang. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar corporate number. He almost ignored it. Instead, he answered. "Calvin Brooks." There was a brief silence. Then Vanessa spoke. "I need your help." He stopped hammering. For several seconds, neither of them said another word. Finally, he asked, "Why would you ask the man you fired?" "Because I think I made a mistake." Calvin leaned against the unfinished counter. "What happened?" "A child became seriously ill after eating one of our new breakfast products." His expression changed immediately. "How serious?" "The doctors believe the child will recover." Calvin quietly exhaled. "What do you need from me?" Vanessa seemed surprised by the question. "I expected you to refuse." "I asked what you need." She hesitated. "The legal team wants us to wait." "And you?" I don't know who to trust anymore. Calvin looked toward the bakery window. Children were leaving Lincoln Elementary across the street, laughing as they climbed onto buses. One little boy carried a lunchbox almost identical to the one Eli used every morning. When are next deliveries scheduled? Calvin asked. Tomorrow. Then you don't have much time. You still haven't answered my question. Calvin remained silent for a moment. He could simply hang up. Caldwell Nutrition had taken his career. Its executives had questioned his integrity. Its CEO had tried to buy the bakery he was risking everything to build. He owed them nothing. Yet he couldn't stop thinking about those school buses, those cafeterias, those children who would never know his name. When I warned the company before, he finally said, I was trying to protect Caldwell Nutrition. I know. I was trying to protect kids. Vanessa closed her eyes. I understand that now. Then listen carefully. Calvin walked toward the blueprint spread across the bakery counter. This may not be the ingredient itself. What do you mean? If the formula changed, but the cleaning process between production runs didn't. He paused, remembering Arthur Caldwell's handwritten warning. You could be dealing with cross-contact inside the production line. Vanessa grabbed a notebook. Cross-contact? Between two product streams. Can that happen? It can if a physical separation system was removed or bypassed. Silence filled the line. Finally, Vanessa whispered, How would you know that? Calvin looked toward the rolled blueprint from the town archive. I'll explain later. What do you need? I need to see your current production layout. Miles entered the conference room just as Vanessa lowered the phone. She looked directly at him. I want the complete engineering drawings for line 4. Miles didn't move. Why? Because Calvin believes something important is missing. For the first time since the crisis began, Miles didn't answer immediately. His hesitation lasted only a heartbeat, but it was long enough for Vanessa to notice. Miles recovered almost instantly. Line 4? He asked with a practiced smile. Engineering can pull those files, but I don't see how they'll help. Vanessa didn't look away. I didn't ask whether you thought they would help. She held his gaze until he nodded toward the engineering department. I'll have them sent up. Less than 30 minutes later, the blueprints covered the entire conference table. Engineers, attorneys, production managers, and quality supervisors gathered around them while rain continued to strike the windows overlooking downtown Pittsburgh. Vanessa dialed Calvin on speaker. The drawings are here. Good, Calvin replied. Start at the ingredient intake. She traced the first section with her finger. Done. Now follow both product lines toward the blending station. I see them. Do they merge? One of the engineers answered. Yes, they share a transfer chamber before cleaning. Calvin became quiet. They never used to. The room fell silent. What do you mean? Vanessa asked. The original system kept specialty formulas physically separated before they reached the cleaning stage. Miles folded his arms. That's an outdated design. Calvin ignored him. Keep following the drawings. Vanessa continued studying the blueprint until she stopped. There are bolt holes marked here. Another engineer leaned over. That's strange. What? It looks like something used to be installed between these two sections. Calvin spoke before anyone else could. A separation valve. The words seemed to freeze the room. Miles shook his head immediately. There hasn't been a valve there in years. I know. Calvin's voice remained calm. That's exactly the problem. Vanessa looked toward the engineering director. Was one removed? The man searched through the revision history. Revision 22, he frowned, shows a redesign 11 years ago. Vanessa looked at the date. The same year Miles Denton became Chief Operating Officer. What changed? She asked. The engineer swallowed. It says the physical separation valve was removed. Why? He continued reading. To improve production speed by eliminating redundant transfer delays. Calvin closed his eyes for a moment. Arthur Caldwell's handwritten warning echoed through his memory. Never remove the separation system under any circumstance if children's specialty formulas are being produced. Vanessa slowly lowered the blueprint. Was another safety measure added? The engineer searched again. Only a revised sanitation procedure between production runs. Physical separation was replaced with cleaning. According to the records, yes. Miles finally stepped forward. The sanitation protocol exceeded industry requirements. Calvin answered before Vanessa could. On paper. Nobody interrupted him. If cleaning isn't performed perfectly every single cycle, residue from one formula can enter the next. One of the quality managers quietly asked. Cross-contact. Exactly. The room grew noticeably quieter. Vanessa looked toward Miles. Did anyone evaluate the long-term risk before removing the valve? It was approved. That's not what I asked. Miles' confidence began to crack. It reduced production costs. And the safety review? There were no documented failures. Calvin spoke softly. Because the valve had prevented them. Another engineer suddenly looked up from an older maintenance log. Miss Caldwell. He held out a faded inspection record. The original valve wasn't scheduled for replacement. So why was it removed? He hesitated. It says, his eyes moved across the page once more. Removed under executive authorization. Whose authorization? The engineer looked toward Miles before answering. Chief Operations. Nobody needed another explanation. Vanessa slowly turned toward Miles. You authorized this. It was an operational decision. Without consulting safety, it complied with regulations. Calvin's voice remained steady. I warned the company that removing physical separation increased contamination risk. Vanessa looked back at the restored reports she'd recovered only hours earlier. There it was, page 16, highlighted in yellow. Exactly as Calvin had said. Recommendation rejected. Further review requested. No response recorded. She finally understood. He hadn't been warning the company about a single ingredient. He had been warning them about an entire system. Miles straightened his jacket. You're building a theory around one maintenance decision made over a decade ago. Calvin answered quietly. Then explain why Arthur Caldwell wrote that the valve should never be removed. Silence. Vanessa looked at Miles one last time. For the first time since she'd become CEO, she no longer saw an experienced executive standing across the table. She saw a man trying to defend a decision that no longer made sense. She picked up the old maintenance record. Then the restored engineering report. Then Arthur Caldwell's scanned letter Claire had retrieved from the archives. 3 documents. 3 different decades. 1 identical warning. And every one of them pointed in the same direction. Vanessa slowly closed the file. "I think this meeting is over." Nobody moved. Finally, she spoke again. Except for Mr. Denton. Everyone else quietly gathered their papers and left the conference room. As the heavy door closed behind them, Miles realized there would be no audience left to protect him. Only the truth. And a CEO who had finally decided she was willing to hear it. Miles remained standing after everyone else had left. The conference room felt unusually large without the usual chorus of executives offering opinions or protecting their own departments. Rain continued sliding down the glass walls, turning the city lights into blurred ribbons across the windows. Vanessa placed Arthur Caldwell's handwritten note beside Calvin's original safety report. "You had these reports?" Miles didn't answer. "You received Calvin's recommendations." Silence. "You approved removing the separation valve." He finally pulled out a chair and sat down. "It wasn't that simple." "It rarely is." Miles folded his hands together. The board wanted production expanded before the state contract was awarded. Every delay threatened hundreds of jobs. "So you removed a safety system." "I removed outdated equipment." "You ignored safety." "I followed the consultants." Vanessa slid another document across the table. "The consultants recommended additional testing." Miles looked at the paper without touching it. "They also estimated a 3-month delay." And if we had missed the contract window, another company would have taken it." He looked directly at her. "You inherited a successful company because someone was willing to make difficult decisions." Vanessa's expression never changed. "No." She spoke quietly. "I inherited a company my father built on trust." The room felt silent again. She picked up the phone. "Claire." "Yes, Miss Caldwell?" "Please ask legal, human resources and compliance to join us." Miles immediately understood. "You don't have to do this." "I do." Within the hour, an emergency board meeting had been called. Vanessa presented every recovered document, the deleted attachments, the engineering revisions, Arthur Caldwell's warning, Calvin's repeated recommendations. Finally, she placed her own termination letter for Calvin onto the table. "I sign this." No one interrupted. "I signed it without demanding the complete technical file." She took a slow breath. "That failure belongs to me." The room remained completely still. Several board members exchanged uneasy glances. One finally asked, "What do you recommend?" Vanessa answered without hesitation. "Immediate suspension of Miles Denton pending an independent investigation." Another director nodded slowly. "And the state contract?" "We notify every participating school district tonight. The financial impact will be severe." So would explaining why we stayed silent. The vote passed. Not unanimously, but decisively. By sunset, Miles surrendered his company badge. He left the headquarters carrying a single cardboard box, saying nothing as employees quietly stepped aside. No one celebrated. There was nothing joyful about watching a career end. The purpose was accountability, not revenge. Meanwhile, 200 miles away, Calvin was replacing cracked floor tiles inside Morning Bell when a familiar sedan stopped outside the bakery once again. This time, Vanessa came alone. No attorneys, no acquisition director, no contract in her hand. Only a thick folder. She stepped inside slowly. "I won't take much of your time." Calvin rested his tools on the counter. "You've said that before." "I know." She placed the folder between them. "It contains every report you submitted." He looked down at the stack of papers. "Every email. every recommendation, every warning he thought had disappeared. I found them. Calvin didn't reach for the folder. I should have read them before I signed your termination. He remained silent. I can't change what happened. No. I can tell the truth about it. Still, he said nothing. Vanessa looked around the unfinished bakery. Dust floated through the afternoon sunlight. The old brick oven stood exactly where it had the first day she visited. Only now she understood why it mattered. I offered you your job back this morning. Calvin finally looked at her. And? The offer still stands. He smiled gently. No. She seemed almost surprised. You haven't even heard the position. I don't need to. It would be a promotion. My son finally believes we're building something together. He glanced toward the display case Eli had carefully measured with Rachel's wooden ruler. I'm not asking him to start over again. Vanessa nodded slowly. I understand. Do you? She thought about it. For the first time, I think I do. Calvin opened the folder. He read only the first page before quietly closing it again. I appreciate the truth. He looked directly at her. But Morning Bell isn't for sale. I know. And I'm not coming back. I know. She smiled faintly. So tell me what would make this right. Calvin answered almost immediately. Protect the people who speak up. She frowned. What do you mean? When the next employee raises a safety concern, he paused. I don't make them choose between their paycheck and doing the right thing. Vanessa stood quietly for several moments. Then she extended her hand. Would you help us build that policy? Calvin looked at her hand, then toward the stairs where Eli's footsteps echoed softly overhead. He wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. But he was ready to make sure another father would never stand where he once had. He shook her hand. On one condition. What is it? Morning Bell stays independent. Vanessa smiled for the first time since walking through those doors. You have my word. As she walked back toward her car, Calvin watched the setting sun reflect off the bakery windows. Tomorrow would be opening day. And for the first time since buying Morning Bell, the future no longer felt like something he was trying to survive. It felt like something he had finally earned. Morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that carried the scent of fallen leaves and fresh coffee down Main Street. Before sunrise, lights glowed inside Morning Bell for the first time in years. Calvin unlocked the front door while Eli switched on the small neon sign in the window. It flickered twice before settling into a warm golden light that spilled across the sidewalk. The bakery no longer looked abandoned. Fresh paint covered the walls. The display case sparkled beneath soft light. The old brick oven, once silent, filled the room with the comforting aroma of butter, cinnamon, and warm bread. Marisol arrived carrying 2 trays of pastries. I figured partners should be early. Calvin smiled. I was hoping you'd say yes. She laughed. I already did. The two of them moved through the kitchen with an easy rhythm that had grown naturally over the past weeks. While Calvin checked the bread, Marisol organized the front counter, and Eli carefully wiped fingerprints from the glass one last time. Then he reached into his backpack. Without saying a word, he carried Rachel's old wooden ruler to the counter. He placed it beneath a framed photograph of his mother. Calvin watched quietly. You sure? Eli nodded. It belongs here. The ruler no longer measured dough. It measured something far more important. Every loaf Calvin sliced that morning was lined up against its worn wooden edge before being placed into the display, just as Rachel had always done. Equal pieces, Eli whispered, so nobody feels forgotten. Calvin smiled at the words his wife had spoken so many times. When the clock struck 7, he unlocked the front door. For a brief moment, nobody entered. Then an elderly couple stepped inside. "Smells like bakeries used to smell," the man said. A nurse from the nearby clinic followed. Then a crossing guard. Then 2 steelworkers finishing the night shift. Soon the line stretched onto the sidewalk. Some customers had heard about the reopening. Others had simply followed the smell. Marisol moved easily between the coffee station and the register, while Eli proudly explained each pastry to anyone willing to listen. "My dad made these, and this recipe came from my mom." His excitement spread through the room. People smiled without realizing they were smiling. Late that morning, the front door opened once again. Conversation softened. Vanessa Caldwell walked inside alone. No security, no executives, no reporters. She wore a simple navy coat instead of a business suit. Without asking for special treatment, she quietly joined the end of the line. Several customers recognized her. She ignored the whispers. When her turn finally came, Eli greeted her with the same smile he had offered everyone else. "Good morning." "Good morning," Vanessa replied. "What would you recommend?" Eli looked toward the trays. "The brown butter rolls." "Why those?" "Because my mum used to make them." Vanessa nodded. "I'll take one." As Calvin wrapped the pastry, she placed an envelope on the counter. "I thought you'd want this." Inside was a single document, not a contract, not an employment offer. It was Caldwell Nutrition's newly adopted safety integrity policy. The first page stated that any employee could halt production over documented safety concerns without fear of retaliation while an independent review was completed. Calvin looked up. "You actually did it." "We all signed it." She smiled gently. "The next person who speaks up won't lose a career for doing the right thing." Calvin folded the document carefully. "Thank you." She reached for her wallet. "No discounts." He laughed. "I wasn't planning on giving you one." For the first time, they shared the kind of quiet smile that didn't erase the past, but acknowledged that people could choose a better future. As Vanessa left with her pastry, she paused outside to look back through the bakery window. Inside, she saw Eli standing beside his father, proudly helping customers one by one. She realized Morning Bell had become exactly what Arthur Caldwell had once hoped places connected to food could become. Not just somewhere where people bought breakfast, somewhere they trusted. The lunch crowd slowly replaced the morning rush. Neighbors filled every chair. Children laughed over cinnamon rolls. Workers carried boxes of bread back to nearby shops. Nobody talked about lawsuits or board meetings anymore. They talked about recipes, families, school, life. As the afternoon sun settled across Main Street, Calvin cut the final tray of warm bread into perfectly even portions. He reached for Rachel's wooden ruler one last time, the same ruler that had once rested on a tiny kitchen table. The same ruler Eli had carried through uncertain days. The same ruler that now sat in plain sight for everyone who entered Morning Bell. Calvin looked at his son. "You want to take the first piece?" Eli nodded. Instead of keeping it for himself, he carried it to a young boy, waiting patiently beside his mother, near the door. "Here," Eli said with a smile. "The first one's yours." Calvin watched quietly. He hadn't recovered the years he lost. He hadn't erased the pain of losing his job. But standing inside the bakery, filled with neighbors, friends, and the family he had rebuilt with his own hands, he understood something that no title, paycheck, or executive office could ever give him. His worth had never depended on someone else's signature. It had always been found in the choices he made when no reward was guaranteed. Morning Bell was no longer simply a bakery. It had become a place where kindness was served as faithfully as bread, where truth mattered more than convenience, and where a father showed his son that integrity could outlast injustice. Outside, the old bell above the door rang again. This time it sounded like hope. And maybe that's the moment I'll remember most. Not the boardroom, not the investigation, but the quiet moment when Eli used Rachel's old wooden ruler one last time to divide the first tray of bread into equal pieces, just as his mother once taught him. In that simple act, Calvin didn't just open a bakery, he gave his son a way to carry kindness forward. This story reminds us that dignity isn't proven by winning an argument. It's proven by refusing to abandon your principles, even when they cost you something. One courageous decision may seem invisible today, but years later, it can become the reason someone else is finally protected. Today, think of one place where you're tempted to stay silent because speaking up feels risky. Remember what Calvin chose. Your voice, offered with honesty and respect, might protect someone you'll never even meet. If this story touched your heart, comment 1 below. I'd love to know which moment stayed with you the longest. And before you go, there's another story waiting, one that begins with an ordinary father, an impossible choice, and a moment that changes far more lives than anyone could have imagined.